Okay, well, firstly, I'd just like to thank Philippe and the organisers for inviting me to give this presentation. It's a real honour to be able to do this, particularly on this day, which, as Philippe said, is World Soil Day. When I started my career, which was, I guess I finished my PhD in about 1990, 1991, my first academic job was actually at a place called the Institute of Grassland and Environmental Research, which some of the people in the audience, I think some in particular, will remember well. It was in Aberystwyth in Wales, and the main interest of my research at the time was looking at plants, grassland plants in particular, how they change the communities of organisms in the soil, and the consequences of that for nutrient cycling, carbon cycling, but also for the growth of plants. Now, the reason why I mention this is because I remember very distinctly about 92, 93, around that time, we had a visit from a senior advisor for the Department of Agriculture in the UK. And he came to visit us, and I remember having a conversation with this particular person about the research I was doing. I was sort of quite young and enthusiastic about what I was doing. And after explaining to him, he just simply said these words, which have sort of stuck with me throughout my career. He said, basically, if the grass grows, why does it matter? I was trying to explain to him about the importance of these soil organisms, and basically, he was either winding me up or he simply wasn't convinced. And I think I tried to sort of give him an explanation as to why, and I probably failed. But I guess what I'm saying is I wish he was here today, because I think we could very easily give him evidence that actually soil biodiversity does matter for the way that grass grows. And just another sort of thing that's happened throughout my career is I remember, as many others will, that journals like the Journal of Ecology, it was just mentioned to me by Mike Swift, they very rarely used to publish work on soil-related research at that particular time. But now it is one of the main areas of research within that journal, which is concerned with the factors that control the growth of plants and changes in plant community structure. And just as a way of advertising, actually, we have a special issue for the journal which sort of illustrates that particular point, which I'll actually send, I think, to this policymaker who challenged me all those years ago. As Philippe said, what I've been asked to do is actually quite a sort of unenviable thing to do, is that to actually identify some of the future challenges in soil biodiversity research. And this is actually quite an unenviable thing to do, and it's almost unfair, I think, for one individual to put their ideas forward. So what I've actually done is sit through this conference and put this presentation together as I've sat through the meeting. So hopefully it reflects some of the things that I've heard, or some of the major themes that have been discussed at this meeting, as well as some of my own views, inevitably, in terms of the future directions in terms of soil biodiversity research. I did start yesterday, I think I had about sort of 10 or 12 different challenges, but what I've done is condense them down to 4 general challenges, which I think are things which have been covered in many of the talks today. So what I'm going to do is just really go through these very quickly and just sort of identify some of the issues in terms of where we are, in terms of what we've heard at this meeting, but also some of the sort of directions for the future, which is, as I said, drawing on some of the things that we've heard in the meeting. So I think to start with, we obviously know an awful lot about the organisms. We still don't know much compared to, say, other organisms above ground, but I think we know a tremendous amount now about what is in the soil and the range of organisms that live there. So we have reasonably good information on diversity and abundance in some systems on different groups of organisms. But I think one of the things that's become very clear from this meeting, but also if you look at the literature, is that we still know remarkably little, I would say, about the spatial and temporal distribution of those organisms and the factors that actually drive that diversity in terms of its actual structure. Now, this is a slide that Carl Ritz, who I can see in the audience, put together some years ago, and it really reflects ideas that have been proposed by many other. Christine Ettimer and David Wardle, for example, put a theoretical framework together to look at the different factors that drive diversity at different spatial and temporal scales. And I guess the key thing is that at different scales, different factors regulate the diversity, the activity, and the abundance of different organisms. And this slide, I apologize for the quality because it's not Carl's fault, it's actually the computer which seems to have changed the pixelation. But it shows that very clearly in that it depends on the scale that you're looking at. At very large scales, different factors will regulate diversity. whereas you can go right down to the microscale where various physical, chemical factors will regulate the diversity of those organisms. And as far as I'm concerned, if we really want to understand how important diversity is functionally, we still need to know what factors regulate that diversity in the first place. And to do that, we need to look at these different scales. Now, there is progress being made, and we've heard about some of this. There's a young gentleman in the audience here who had this paper last week, for example, and it really just sort of illustrates how rapidly the field is developing. This was a study on a whole range of sites across different locations. David Wardle also talked about it yesterday. And I guess what it shows that globally, there are patterns of diversity in relation to latitude, in this case for soil fungi. And at this scale, those patterns are predominantly driven by climatic and also soil physical or chemical related factors. And there's also this pattern that David picked up yesterday in relation to the ratio of fungal to plant richness, which changes as you move towards the poles. Now, this is just one group of organisms. In this particular study, it was on total richness of fungi. Different groups of fungi responded differently to that gradient. But I guess what's really needed is a comprehensive study of different groups of organisms within the food web to really understand how these organisms are distributed at these kind of global scales. Just to take that a little further, and this is really drawing on some of our own work at a regional scale or landscape scale, there is evidence starting to emerge. Noah Ferreira, for example, talked about some of this in his presentation. This is actually one of our own studies that we did where we sampled a range of grasslands across England. And similar to the previous study, we used modelling approaches to explain the variation in microbial community structure within these grassland soils. And a similar kind of message emerges to what Noah was talking about and in the previous study. This is the fungal to bacterial biomass ratio, which we modelled in relation to various factors. Climatic and soil physical chemical factors are the dominant factors explaining that variation. But what we also detected here was a signal of the plant traits. So there's also biological or biotic factors that can actually explain part of that variation, at least at this landscape scale. And then if you go even finer detail into the system, if you look at a very local scale, other factors like plant traits, for example, different kinds of traits, physiological traits, morphological traits, but also biotic traits, nitrogen fixation, mycorrhizal status, also play a significant role within a physically complex environment. So to me, one of the sort of challenges that really does remain is to actually understand and develop theoretical frameworks to actually be able to predict how these patterns will change in response to global change. And for me, that's a prerequisite to understanding the functional importance of those systems. Because if we know how they're distributed and how they respond to global change, we can start to look at how those changes matter for different ecosystem functions. So the next challenge, I guess, is really at the core of this meeting, in that many of the presentations have considered the functional significance of soil biodiversity. Many of the talks we've heard have considered bacterial communities and done various experiments to look at how the diversity of those communities influences a range of processes. Now, I guess another sort of issue in this area is sort of summarized by this piece of work. This was a synthesis that myself, Dinah Wall, and Uffe Nielsen did a few years ago. But I think the same message that emerged from this synthesis remains today. I guess what it actually shows is that this was a synthesis of all the diversity function experiments done in soil at that particular time. It was published in 2011, so there'll be several studies to add to it now. But basically, it showed that diversity function relationships are highly variable. They can be positive, they can be negative, they can be neutral. And in most cases, where possible to detect this, the responses appear to be driven by the traits of the organisms or particular biotic interactions. But I guess one thing that's clearly holding back the relevance of these studies, and this is something that Marcel talked about in his talk, is that most of these studies so far have drawbacks in terms of their artificial nature of the physical structure of the soil. the number of species that are used in these experiments. And these are understandable limitations because it's a very difficult thing to do to experimentally manipulate communities. But I guess the problem remains in terms of extrapolating this information to the real world. And that, to me, is a major challenge. And I think this talk has this meeting has reflected that in some different ways. In that we've already heard, for example, from Marcel, he was talking about their studies with Cameron Wag looking at multifunctionality and how he's been adapting those studies to look at the relevance of changes in diversities in more complex or more realistic systems in his lysimeters. And also we've heard from David, for example, yesterday, David Wardle, about their studies in real ecosystems, in successional gradients, how you can actually identify the role of particular groups of organisms in ecosystem processes, in this case carbon cycling, at the ecosystem scale. And there are other studies starting to emerge where the kind of approaches that are allowing us, molecular approaches, for example, and stable isotope approaches, are allowing us to actually look at real-world gradients of diversity in response to land use change, climate change, successional gradients, and actually identify the role of soil organisms in explaining how processes change along those gradients. So just another example, Diana touched on this study yesterday. This was a study of different land use systems across Europe in situ, and using various statistical approaches, it was able to at least relate changes in soil communities to ecosystem processes, carbon and nitrogen cycling, at the field scale. These are just statistical relationships, so they're not necessarily causal, but at least they give relevant information at the field scale. And finally, there was a study also done last year where they manipulated, based on the size of the organisms, the diversity, or at least the composition of animal communities across different biomes in situ, which again gives information on the role of these organisms at the real ecosystem scale. And we've also heard, I think, about different kind of approaches which will enable us, I think, to go even further in terms of looking at the role of diversity in real ecosystems and within complex communities. So not just bacteria or fungi, looking at the actual complex communities that form within these soil systems. And just to give an example, firstly, we heard from Wim van der Putten at the beginning of the conference about the use of network analysis, for example. And these networks, which are also basically correlational, but what they can show is different kinds of relationships between different groups of organisms, in this case between trees and mycorrhizal fungi, and we can start to piece that together and at least relate those changes to ecosystem processes at the field scale. And Wim, in his presentation, showed this in relation to successional changes in grasslands, and again, this offers potential, I think, in the future to explore these real-world changes and how they affect ecosystem processes in the real world. The other area which I think has become prominent in this particular meeting, we've heard a lot about this, particularly from microbiologists, is a trait-based approach. This has been used for many years now in plant ecology, for example, and also in studies looking at how plant community change can impact on soil communities and the processes that they drive. But we're also beginning to hear now in this meeting and in publications about the potential for these trait-based approaches in microbial ecology to unravel some of the complexities in terms of understanding how changes in soil communities impact on processes in the real world and at the field scale. Just before I leave the area of diversity function, I think it's important to recognize that there are many other types of interactions, biotic interactions in the soil, and there is literature coming up all the time revealing almost like novel ways in which below-ground communities can impact upon plant-plant interactions or on plant production and different ecosystem processes. And I've just pulled out a couple of examples here. This is one from Dave Johnson's work in Aberdeen. And Dave did some very elegant work last year, which was in Ecology Letters with a group of people from Rothamsted. And basically what they showed is that mycorrhizal networks can actually act as a sort of conduit for signals involved in plant defense. So herbivores attacking these plants would induce the transfer of signals to neighboring plants, which would allow them to produce defense compounds to protect them against defense from herbivore attack. And likewise, yesterday in the presentation, we were told a little bit about some of the interactions in relation to crop production. And again, there's a bit of a sort of revival in terms of intercropping systems and understanding the biological mechanisms involved in the liberation of nutrients and the benefits that neighboring crops can actually reap from that. So we've talked a little bit here about general diversity function relationships, but I think all the time novel mechanisms in terms of how these biotic interactions impact on plants, plant-plant interactions and the growth of those plants, and these are things which are directly applicable to sustainable agriculture, are emerging all the time. So the final area I just want to touch on concerns global change, climate change. And again, this was an area that David talked about yesterday, and many other people gave presentations. And I guess one of the sort of key points is that David emphasized in the presentation yesterday is that these responses to global change are extremely variable. They depend on the actual context, the environment in which is being subject to global change, but they also depend on the actual global change driver and the interactions between those drivers. Again, we heard about these interactive effects of different global change drivers on biotic interactions yesterday. But I think one thing that's certainly happened in recent years, which is a very positive move, is that our understanding of the role of these soil changes in terms of the biodiversity, or just at least in terms of the involvement of soil organisms, is beginning to be integrated into our understanding of entire ecosystem responses to global change. And this is just one example of this. This is a study on elevated CO2 done in Duke by Drake et al., which was in Ecology Letters a couple of years ago. And this is really just to illustrate how an understanding of soil and the biotic interactions that occur in soil in relation to global change can actually inform on the total ecosystem responses to global change. In this particular system, elevated CO2 increased tree growth, exudation of carbon into the soil. It induced changes in the composition of those communities and their activity, which fueled, in terms of nitrogen supply, an increase in primary productivity of the trees in that system. So while there was an increase in plant production, there was also a reduction in carbon in the soil. So through understanding the role of soil organisms in this system, you can start to model the actual response of total ecosystems to environmental change. But the final area I just want to touch on, because I'm aware that time is running out, is that there is also research starting to emerge in terms of how organisms in the soil actually cope with environmental change. And this is an area I think that is relatively underexplored. It's an area which is getting a lot of focus in terms of plant and animal ecology, for example, above ground. But actually our understanding of the evolutionary responses of organisms to environmental change is still very much in its infancy. But studies are starting to emerge. For example, there are studies just simply on soil organisms like mites, which have been shown to show changes, adaptations to climate change, which will affect population dynamics and presumably interactions between organisms. And similarly, changes in soil communities have been shown to affect the plant fitness in different environments. And I think these sort of eco-evolutionary responses, which we've heard a little about, offers an area which is really ripe for exploration, in that we know an increasing amount about community responses to global change and the effects on processes. But what I think we really need to know now is how these evolutionary responses also impact on ecosystem processes. So I can see Philip standing there, which suggests to me that I'm going to have to be quiet. So I just want to finish by saying that the final challenge I said is to obviously integrate this, but this is really just a leader to the next speakers who I think are going to continue to consider this area. And finally, just for the benefit of Johan Six, I was asked to highlight this new journal, which has been put forward with the obvious title of Soil. And on that note, I'll finish.
Many thanks, Richard. So we have time for 2 questions. Questions, comment? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for the talk. you told about food webs, you told about signaling and new mechanism. I think maybe we could add physical engineering in soil. Mm-hmm. And don't you think that one of the major challenges is to couple all these mechanisms to be able to predict future interaction in soils? The coupling of the mechanism is maybe one also of the major challenge for the future, no?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. In that, I guess that's the ultimate challenge, really, is that all these interactions occur at different scales. They all interact with other carbon and nutrient cycles are coupled, etc. But I think the point you made about the physical properties as well is a very important one. Obviously, I've only got a short amount of time, but I think we can't really analyze these responses without also considering changes in the physical environment. So these changes in plant communities, soil communities will also impact on physical properties, which will affect the environment in which those organisms survive. So I absolutely agree that there's a need to integrate these studies of abiotic and biotic responses to global change.
Okay, another question or comment? All right, okay, sorry.
Hi, I like to see the coevolutionary papers that you mentioned at the end. However, we are going, I think, like at a step forward because we still don't know how plant genetic variation, etc., affects soil properties. So I just wanted to ask you, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of touched on this on the plant traits in terms of the roots, in that there is obviously potential for inter- and intra-species variation to impact on soil communities. And again, it sort of relates to the point that was made before, in that these things are all entirely coupled, in that the plants obviously impact on the soil organisms, and that could lead to evolutionary responses, and similarly that could feed back to the plants in terms of affecting plant fitness. Yeah, so I think, I mean, it's obviously a sort of a need for a sort of holistic approach in terms of how all these different interactions occur.